The 1990s begin with the presidency of George H.W. Bush. These years are a pretty significant transition period internally, but an enormous change for the order externally. It brings up a lot of new questions, and sees the start of a decade that for the most part, many people tend to think of as a high point. George H.W. Bush was born in June of 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts. His father was notable investment banker and Senator Prescott Bush. The family is related to many notable families, some whose prominence in the United States goes back quite far in history, like the Livingstons, Beekmans, Schowlers, and Van Cortlandts. After the post-war order began, when the traditional ruling class of the United States found itself no longer at the head of the country, and the order changed, many of these old families faded from prominence, while others adapted. Some were resistant to the changes, preferring the old ways, yet attempting to preserve the wealth and enterprise that they still had, while others joined on board the new regime. Some had joined the British imperial faction long ago. Some of them, upon finding that the winds had changed, would simply attempt to move into the new regime, the new order, and though it wouldn't be the same as the old one, perhaps they could keep themselves in a good spot, some of them managing more prominence than others, while others continued to resist. After an unsuccessful Senate bid in 1964, in 1966, H.W. Bush would become a representative for Texas. He held many significant government roles: ambassador to the UN, chairman of the RNC, chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in the People's Republic of China, and the director of the CIA in 1976. In 1980, he would become vice president to Ronald Reagan, taking on a very active role, particularly in foreign policy. Just at the beginning of 1991, the United States would launch Operation Desert Storm, a coalition military effort to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The operation would be extremely successful and swift. The administration and its political allies were concerned that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein may gain too powerful a position over the Middle East's oil supply if he were able to have control of Kuwait. They were also concerned about what this would mean for U.S. hegemony and the power of the order in the region. That if Saddam were able to make a move like this, then the ability for the Anglo American order to be able to assert control over such a vital economic region may be weakened or at worst eliminated. There had increasingly become an unspoken notion of you can't escape the order, that all of the world was subject to the order, and it looked like Saddam Hussein was indeed attempting to escape it. To the public, the administration spoke of international law and regional stability, which is something that we'll see a lot over the coming years. The modern notion of international law really begins to get born at the end of the Second World War, and the international law concept that we live in today is largely the rules of this international order, the rules of the Anglo American hegemony, all stemming from rules arrived at in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's a framework set up by the Anglo American order and the global liberal order more broadly as its framework. And since that is the framework that allows the great powers to exist and continue to assert their great power status, allowing those ruling factions to continue to rule, then seeing a nation attempt to break away from that is an enormous risk. Yet at the time, in 1991, Desert Storm was swift and highly successful. The population generally felt favorably toward it. The thing that really tends to upset Americans is being stuck in quagmires. But at least right now, America seemed to be able to impose its authority effectively, and the order seemed to be securely on top. Yet there was still one piece looming, though greatly weakened. The one true opposition that the order still had to contend with was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been falling apart, and in many regards liberalizing. Yet it was still the one true challenger to the hegemonic might of the order. But that would all change. In December 1991, the Soviet Union would be dissolved, and the unipolar moment would begin. The fall of the Soviet Union would be a profound psychological shift for the United States, and for the rest of the West more broadly. It was the unipolar moment. There was no longer a rival to the Anglo America dominated liberal world order. A notion began to emerge: the end of history. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama would publish The End of History and the Last Man, The book argued that liberal democracy was the end state of human civilization, that though things would keep happening in the world, civilizations would cease developing new systems, as there was nowhere else to go from here. We had done it. We had figured out the perfect system, and now all that was left to do was to solidify the liberal world order into the perfect utopia. It was extremely ideological, as it was naive. Of course, this did not happen. But so often in history, when a civilization feels itself to be supremely powerful, and in a time of great stability and plenty, it thinks, well, we must have done it. We must have figured out the perfect way to live. There's nowhere else to go from here. And that's how a lot of people in the West began to feel. There would be an enormous tech boom driving up valuations in the stock market. People began quitting their jobs to day trade .com stocks, new internet companies that were achieving enormous valuations on the excitement and promise of the internet. The only problem, many of them didn't do anything. But this was a time of supreme optimism, and much of it ill-founded. Bill Clinton would be elected in 1992. He was the new, young, slick, cool type of Democrat. It was a major rebranding for the party, who had been on the back foot for many years now. He branded himself as a new Democrat. As the governor of Arkansas, he focused on education reform, welfare reform, and took a position in support of smaller government. This wave of new Democrats was different than the progressivists of old. At the same time, they also sought to distance themselves from the more radical New Left. They began to become much friendlier with business, and over time would begin to lose working class support. But in the 1990s, and especially with Bill Clinton, he projected youthful optimism, a new more moderate Democratic Party, one that could work with the roaring enterprise of the United States, and one that embodied the unipolar moment. Some would raise eyebrows about Bill Clinton's time as governor. Many would publish books and films suggesting that his rise to prominence was fueled by aiding organized crime, particularly offering safe haven to the smuggler Barry Seal, and going so far as to cover up deaths. This speaks to a very curious duality of Bill Clinton. To many, he seems genuinely likable, youthful, and exciting, but many people saw this as sociopathic, too polished, that really he was a darker figure. And this embodied a lot of what the United States was going through at this point. It saw itself as the shining beacon of liberal democracy. But there was this feeling that would grow, that it was all being purchased at hidden costs, that behind the scenes, much darker things were being done in order to assert that powerful hegemony. The 1990s and the unipolar moment got rid of the external threat, and Americans were forced to look inward. This started out exciting. It was Seinfeld times. It was edgy and laid-back Gen X times. But it would also lay the seeds for new doubts. People wondering if the unipolar world was good, and people wondering what its costs were. Having an external enemy is very stabilizing for a civilization. It gives them someone to blame, someone to be scared of, someone to put all their anxieties onto. But when you're the sole power in the world, suddenly the rest of the world becomes a reflection of you. And that can be very difficult for a society to maintain stability through. Internally, the government wasn't sure what it was going to do. There were certainly divisions throughout the 20th century, but once the unipolar moment hit, people in the military, State Department, and intelligence weren't really sure what direction to take. There were whole departments, whole agencies, people who had dedicated their entire lives to studying the Soviet Union in order to oppose them. And now that was gone. It's as though America had lost its purpose. One immediate question that was posed is what the purpose of NATO was. Really, the entire reason this enormous treaty apparatus with its own gigantic bureaucratic structure was created in the first place was as a bulwark against the Soviets. But now that there were no Soviets, this left many people who had dedicated their lives to opposing the Soviets and building up NATO to wonder, why do we exist? Different camps began to form. Some, including those who were very aggressive anti-Soviet hawks, believed that there was really no purpose for NATO to be aggressive, that this was an opportunity to be less militaristic, to scale down the defense apparatus, and that NATO could continue to exist, but that it should freeze as it was, and should exist as a treaty bloc, and not as a hegemonic force against the East. Figures like the former Secretary of State James Baker and former Defense Secretary Robert Gates took positions like this. They believed that the United States should seek a friendly and cooperative relationship with the new states that had emerged out of the Soviet Union. While many, particularly many in the Clinton administration, like Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, believed that NATO should expand, that with the Soviets gone, now was the moment, that America should seize this opportunity while there was no resistance, and push its authority further to the east. This also garnered enormous support from the British, who had had a multi-century-long campaign at this point to have control in Eastern Europe, and to ensure a weak Russia. And as had been the case for a very long time now, there was a large chunk of the American ruling class and political apparatus who were deeply intertwined with the ruling powers and institutions of Britain. This problem was bigger than just a difference in opinion. There were entire agencies, entire businesses, and people who had dedicated their entire lives since they were in school just studying the Soviet Union in order to oppose it. They had no purpose without the Soviets, and they needed something to justify their existence. There was also an enormous arms industry. The military-industrial complex of the United States was enormous, so it needed something. A very strong division was occurring within the Republican Party. The neocons had begun to become prominent. This group had emerged from a period of crisis that had plagued the left during the 1960s and 70s. They were disillusioned liberals, largely in that liberal imperialist camp, who believed that liberal hegemony and empire were good. They were left liberals who became disillusioned with the left. They became disillusioned with socialists. They saw the left as having delivered them failures, and that the welfare state of the Great Society had only made people's lives worse. They disapproved of the Great Society notion of using welfare and attempting to replace families with the state. They believed that this was destroying families and fostering dependence, which was a genuine strategy that some in the government were attempting to employ. In this regard, they overlapped to a degree with the more traditionalist right, but they were still very much something different. They were liberal imperialists. They were Straussians. They rejected moral relativism, and they believed that the United States had the responsibility of being a moral leader for the world, that the United States had to be the beacon of liberalism and spread liberalism to the rest of the world. It's that same strain of thought that had emerged a century ago in Great Britain, the British Empire of the white man's burden. And they had many powerful British counterparts, many powerful think tanks, and political figures, British imperialists who supported them. But now for the United States, and in the unipolar moment world, they believed that the United States should expand its hegemony around the world, and that it had a moral duty to intervene when there were places not following that order. Because of this belief, they became quite strong proponents of the military and of organizations like NATO. On the other side of them, you had the paleocons. They largely thought of themselves as the heirs of the old pre-war right. They believed in Burkean conservatism. They valued tradition, prudence, inheritance. They were suspicious of radicalism and believed that society could not be engineered by force, that ideologues and utopians only made the world worse when they tried to sculpt it into their image. They tended to be anti-federalists, who placed a strong value on the rights of states. Many of them took great inspiration from Russell Kirk, often sharing the Kirkian moral values of a belief in a transcendent moral order, a respect for tradition, prudence, variety, a belief in the imperfectibility of human nature, and the importance of prosperity. There was still substantial division on the left, yet with the presidency of Bill Clinton, the neoliberal values of the New Democrats, particularly their more business-friendly attitude, would become dominant in the party, while the more radical New Left would continue to make gains in academia. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement would be penned. It created a trade zone, including the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Its overarching goal was the elimination of trade barriers. It also increased ease of investment between the countries. It was generally supported by the major ruling factions, including the H.W. Bush administration, who had played a role in developing it, the Clinton administration, and much of Congress. Yet, many labor organizations opposed it fervently. They believed that it put American labor at risk. Industry groups as well would become a part of this opposition, believing that there would be sectors of the American economy that would be hurt by it. People were concerned that investment, capital, and jobs would all go out to Mexico. And environmental groups jumped in as well, concerned that this would just be an opportunity for people to do the same business, but in a place with much more lax environmental standards. Just as proponents argued that labor concerns were addressed, they would also argue that environmental concerns had been taken care of. But this really wasn't believable, and over time the agreement would prove to do the things that its detractors feared. Yet how one feels about the trade-off largely came down to whether they benefited or not. This era was a continuation of what had been seen for the prior decades. Investors and capital were benefiting. Wealth was leaving the country. Jobs were leaving the country. And American industry continued to dry up. At the same time, China was beginning to emerge as an economic player. And people quickly became concerned that even more industry would end up over in China. That investors would take their money, move it out of the United States, park it into foreign companies, benefit foreign industry, and use their labor, all with lower standards, getting quite wealthy in the process, while more of America dried up. And this is a trend that is not going to go away, and will become one of the most powerful points of resentment for the lower classes of the United States. Bill Clinton is impeached by the House in 1998. Well, I guess that depends on what the definition of is. But ultimately, there would be a federal budget surplus in 1998. This is quite curious, and it did take a certain degree of austerity, as well as some dragging money to the present. It really wasn't sustainable, and in the Triffin Dilemma world, it would prove to not be able to last. People tend to remember the 90s favorably. Cell phones, home computers, video games. It was a really fun tech era that felt like the country was innovating. There were many new cultural developments at this time. The Simpsons, Friends, Seinfeld, The X-Files. It's a time that really sticks in people's memories, being remembered as very optimistic. Sure, there were problems, but even the president's impeachment was kind of goofy. But perhaps to be overly metaphoric, the 90s were like getting home after a long day, sitting down on the couch and thinking about your life. What am I gonna do next? Britain would enter the Persian Gulf War in 1991 with the United States. The reasons were shared: maintain the order, ensure hegemony, and keep control over the region. The Conservatives would secure a majority under Major for the fourth consecutive term in 1992. And the following year, the Maastricht Treaty would create the European Union. The United Kingdom would be a party to the agreement, but would opt out of the single currency, keeping the pound. The prior year, on September 16th, 1992, a sharp crash in the pound would force Britain to withdraw from the exchange rate mechanism. Under the exchange rate mechanism, the British pound had been fixed at a constant conversion rate to the German Deutschmark. However, the British pound was overvalued. The UK was in a recession and had high unemployment. On top of that, German rates were unusually high as they were adjusting to reunification. On September 15th, 1992, German Bundesbank President Helmut Schlesinger would comment on the currency situation. He wouldn't be so bold as to attack the pound, but the damage was done. The market took it as a sign that the British pound was overvalued. The next day, the pound began to sell off, and sell off massively. Yet there were some more players behind the scenes who had seen this coming for a while and had acted in anticipation, themselves playing a role in the pound's collapse that would become remembered as Black Wednesday. The largest and most notable of these players was the hedge fund of George Soros. The trade was managed by the legendary trader Stan Druckenmiller. This exchange rate imbalance had been recognized, and the firm borrowed an enormous amount of money, putting their entire portfolio in a bet against the pound, going short the British pound and long German assets. Altogether, the fund would be 300% invested in this short pound bet. And as they put on their trades, such an enormous short would send ripple effects around the currency markets. Yet one figure who didn't get much attention, at least at the time, was a young analyst who realized that Britain had become boxed in on their interest rates, owing to the nature of how Britons financed their homes. He would build models to attempt to figure out what would happen to British interest rates, what their risk was if they were to short the pound, and what a proper exchange rate should be. This young Soros analyst was Scott Bessent, who is, at the time of filming this, the Secretary of the Treasury. The Bank of England would step in, trying to defend the pound. They would spend billions of their foreign reserves and raise rates from 10 to 15%. But ultimately, they could not hold back the selling pressure. Chancellor Norman Lamont would announce that Britain was leaving the exchange rate mechanism. And now, in 1993, as Europe was building one common currency, Britain would keep its own. The mid-90s were a unique cultural time for Britain. It became associated with the notion of cool Britannia. It was a new optimism in Britain, a new wave of cultural products in the United Kingdom. New film, new fashion, new music. It would be best embodied by the phrase frequently used by Tony Blair and by Labour, "Things can only get better." And in 1994, Tony Blair would become the leader of the Labour Party. Under their new image, New Labour. New Labour sought to be a modernization of the Labour Party, easing off the socialism of old Labour. They pitched themselves as a third way, proponents of a free market economy, and of left-wing social justice. In large part, it was an effort to appeal to the middle class. They were very focused on image management, drawing closer to media. They campaigned on education reform, the NHS, and crime. Under the leadership of Tony Blair, Labour were attempting a radical image change. In 1993, Tony Blair had written a pamphlet for the Fabian Society, criticizing how one of their foundational documents was written, specifically Clause 4 of the Labour Party rulebook. Clause 4 called for the common ownership of the means of production, yet Blair would give a speech, putting forward a rewriting of this section. It, in part, reads, "The Labour Party are a democratic socialist party. It believes that by the strength of our common endeavour, we achieve more than we achieve alone." It was rebranding, and very much in line with the aesthetics of cool Britannia, as well as being appealing to the middle and managerial classes. However, it was still ultimately socialist and Fabian, in many ways more a tactical and aesthetic change than a fundamental one. In 1997, Tony Blair and New Labour would win in a landslide, with him becoming Prime Minister. Tony Blair was born on May 6, 1953. He would attend a quite prestigious boarding school in Edinburgh before going to study at Oxford. There he would become quite involved with the political ideology of Trotskyism, before ultimately becoming involved with Labour. He would begin his career as a barrister in commercial and employment law. He would make an unsuccessful bid for Parliament, before ultimately being elected as MP for Sedgefield in 1983. From there, he would work his way up in the Shadow Cabinet, ultimately becoming Shadow Home Secretary. He would be elected leader of the Labour Party in 1994, standing against his friend, Gordon Brown. And from there, after a few years of marketing and campaigning, become Prime Minister, launching the political era that has defined Britain ever since, Blairism. Blairism is New Labour, and New Labour is Blairism. It's corporatist and socialist, extremely bureaucratic and managerial. It's Fabian and it's globalist. It's highly concerned with image and media. It holds socialist ideals of social justice and is highly legalistic. It is built around the support of the middle class, yet embodies much of Britain's elite and quite rapidly built an enormous administrative apparatus, firmly entrenching it in the British civil service. It asserted itself over Britain extremely effectively. That year, the Bank of England would be granted operational independence with respect to the setting of interest rates. The following year, the Good Friday Agreement would be reached, ending most of the violence associated with the Troubles of Northern Ireland. That same year, the Human Rights Act would pass, and Britain would adopt the European Constitution on Human Rights, further drawing it into the legal framework of the European Union. Another major political shift would happen the following year. Political authority would be devolved in Scotland and Wales, moving some power from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. Another wave of Celtic nationalism would begin around this time. At the same time, another major shift would occur in Parliament, and the majority of hereditary peers would be removed from the House of Lords, further beating down the clearly already destroyed nobility to further entrench the order of Blairism. The old was out, the new was in, and Blair was on top. Have you ever noticed all the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Georgian, former Soviet tycoons who all seem to want to show up in London? It's said that the London property market is just the best place to put your money, but I suppose it's also just the best place to buy a sports team or a whole company. Figures like Roman Abramovich, Oleg Deripaska, Arkady and Boris Rotenberg, Suleiman Kerimov, and Alexander Zhukov. London sure seems to be a destination for post-Soviet businessmen. Slavic oligarchs sure seem to like London banks a whole lot. Edmond Safra is a Lebanese, Brazilian, Jewish-Syrian billionaire banker who, as his description indicates, has been all around the world quite a lot. His father, Jacob Safra, had opened J.E. Safra Bank in 1920 in Beirut, Lebanon. The bank was highly successful, and ultimately, he moved the family to Milan. At a very young age, Edmund would prove to be an enormously successful banker and trader as well. He became involved in currency arbitrage, making himself $40 million by the age of 16. And keep in mind, this is in 1940s money. He would ultimately start his own bank in Switzerland, which was enormously successful. It would operate as a development bank, and serving the needs of extremely wealthy clients from around the world. One odd quirk about it, however, its bookkeeping was done entirely in ancient Arabic script. He would go on to found Republic National Bank in New York, quickly building up 80 branches, making it the third largest bank in New York by branches, behind only Citigroup and Chase Manhattan. He would begin working closely with clients in Monaco, Luxembourg, and Switzerland, ultimately forming Safra Republic Holdings in Luxembourg. He was an enormously successful and powerful banker, serving the needs of wealthy clients around the world. He had entered into a powerful niche of private and development banking in a relatively short amount of time, and in 1996, he would begin working with Benny Steinmetz and Bill Browder, putting $25 million into a new hedge fund, Hermitage Capital. They pitched their fund as shareholder rights activism in the recently broken up Soviet Union. They would go into former Soviet countries and buy assets from businessmen or from the state, becoming owners and facilitators for some of the largest industries in all of Eastern Europe, making them one of the world's most powerful financial firms, and very quickly. They had a powerful say in how Eastern Europe would be built and who would run it. Their pitch was that they would buy undervalued, state-owned, or oligarch-owned companies, and then expose their corruption. Once the corruption had been exposed and expunged, the company price would go way up. Now, much of what actually happened is shrouded in mystery. The story the firm tells is one of exposing corruption, and that they were forced out of Russia by the corrupt Putin government. However, apparently the less corrupt Yeltsin government seemed to have no problem with them. The Russian side of the story is that British funds were taking money from powerful British financiers and from British agencies that wanted influence in Russia, and using that to pick who the new oligarchs would be. That the Putin government wanted them out, because he didn't want the British government and British businessmen to be running the country. Hermitage made investments in companies like Gazprom, Sberbank, Avisma, United Energy Systems, Surgutneftegaz, and Sedanco. The trouble is that when you're an investor on that scale, where you are in the position to mint new oligarchs of the country, you are probably going to draw some ire from that government if you're a foreigner, and especially a foreigner from a country that has been trying to gain that level of influence in your country for 300 years. So perhaps they were above-board businessmen, but they were minting oligarchs, and they were asserting British hegemony in Russia. And that would happen in many other cases than just this one fund. The British state would put a lot of effort into attempting to direct precisely where the Soviet assets went and who got to run them. They attempted to state build, and as so much British money made its way into the former Soviet states, and so many business leaders of those countries were picked by British institutions, that created an extremely powerful link between the two countries. there are major stories continuing to surface today. Lord Lebedev, a British peer in the House of Lords, is the son of Alexander Lebedev, a KGB agent and Russian oligarch. He became a major media player in Britain, the owner of the Evening Standard and the Independent. He gained his peerage because it was Boris Johnson who wanted it. Lord Baker of Battle, a longtime associate of Roman Abramovich, and another member of the House of Lords, became chairman of EN Plus Group, a substantial holding company for the Russian aluminum tycoon Oleg Deripaska. Lord Baker would attempt to have those interests removed from American sanctions following the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War in 2022. Another British peer, Lord Fairfax of Cameron, became the director of Sovcomflot, a Russian shipping company. London isn't just a good real estate market. There are very deep ties between Britain and the post-Soviet countries, with some of the oligarchs being chosen by British businessmen and the British government. Following the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War, there were some in Britain who were upset not because of the conflict, but because they felt that their business interests were being violated. The link between London and Moscow is very deep. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Western countries and institutions acted under the Washington Consensus, a belief that if they stabilized these countries and got them to adopt liberalization and privatization, then they would become like the West and prosperous. Institutions like the IMF would follow a policy of structural adjustment, using the power and influence of their large loans to influence the politics of these countries. Many post-Soviet leaders felt like their hands were tied, as they had to act in certain ways in order to receive IMF funding. That gave the IMF direct political control in these countries. The World Bank would be heavily involved with infrastructure investments, projects extremely pivotal to these countries. A major tenet of the World Bank would be good governance, which is a nice sounding term, but in practice, it means your government has to work the way the order wants it. Similarly to the scale of British investment, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development would direct huge sums of foreign direct investment into these countries, which in turn gave them enormous influence. And this wouldn't be nice handouts because the West wanted to be friendly. This was an enormous move at hegemony and power grab, and it made things worse in most regards. Asset stripping was extremely common. The economy and societies of these countries couldn't just adjust to this new financial order, and perhaps some of those leading these projects were just naive and really thought that they could copy and paste their system on to Eastern Europe. But it's very difficult to believe that they all were that naive. These projects created the oligarchs. The oligarchs exist because of Western money, and because Westerners wanted them there. And so, one of the first objections that the West had to the Putin government was that he wanted their influence out. Western governments and businessmen felt like, I bought and paid for Russia, I should own it. And now this guy coming out of nowhere is telling me no? And that's been this force behind the scenes for decades now that has driven a fair amount of foreign policy. It may not be the main driver, but it's there. The effort to buy Russia failed, as the Putin government ultimately did take over and curtailed the power of the oligarchs. Yet there are still many powerful figures in other Eastern European countries, and some to an extent in Russia, who are inextricably linked to Western institutions, Western financiers, and perhaps more than anything else, to London. The fall of the Soviet Union left a stark power vacuum in Eastern Europe. In June 1991, Slovenia and Croatia would declare independence from Yugoslavia. Political tensions would increase, and ethnic divides in Bosnia and Herzegovina would reach a boiling point. Bosnian Serbs, led by Radovan Karadzic, would form their own Serb National Assembly in response to the Bosnian government's declaration of sovereignty. In February the next year, Bosnia and Herzegovina would hold a referendum on independence. Bosniaks and Croats would generally vote in favor of independence, while Bosnian Serbs who wanted to remain a part of Yugoslavia would generally boycott the referendum. 1 month later, in March of 1992, a Serb would be killed at a wedding in Sarajevo, becoming an enormous national story, acting as a spark, escalating ethnic tensions to a violent breaking point. In April, Bosnian Serb forces would blockade Sarajevo and begin bombing the city. Western governments and international bodies would recognize the independence of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with top figures in the British state rising as particularly dominant voices. In May, a Bosnian Serb army would form under the command of General Ratko Mladic. They would receive support from the Serbian military and quickly take control of almost 70% of Bosnia and Herzegovina's territory. The campaign would be quite brutal, and throughout the summer, media around the world would run stories of Bosnian Serb atrocities and networks of prison camps. Yet, all the while, figures in Britain would remain at the fore, driving an international response. Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd was opposed to direct military intervention, and even if he had supported it, Britain's military was in no shape as a fighting force by this point. Britain had fully made the transition to using soft power. They used media, international organizations, their intelligence apparatus, and diplomats, becoming extremely effective at manipulating international events without the need for kinetic force. Britain had become a master of playing one side off another, making a close friend only to stab them in the back, making different peoples fight each other, stirring up tensions, and coming in as the negotiator. They had become a truly expert soft power force, and Secretary Hurd wanted to use that power. He would ultimately become the dominant driver of a United Nations protection force, with British troops committed to the effort. He would involve Britain and attempt to drive the response of other nations, particularly the United States, who for some time now, Britain had become reliant on for military force in their foreign policy objectives. He would have a tense and complex relationship with many of the actors involved in the conflict. He would attempt to end the conflict and create a new political order in the region. He supported a plan to create a decentralized, multi-ethnic Bosnian federation, where each of the major ethnic groups would have their own decentralized regions in a loose federation. Many came to believe that this plan was laying the groundwork for easy future partition. The term isn't called Balkanization for nothing, yet Secretary Hurd would particularly make a deep enemy in the Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims, who believed that he was legitimizing ethnic cleansing. Lord Carrington would serve as the European Community Special Convoy to Yugoslavia. He was the initial driving force for a decentralized, and dare I say, Balkanized, Bosnian state. He was perhaps the most prime example of that British soft power. He would put forward the Carrington-Cutiliero Plan, the first major proposal for the new Bosnian state. He would be succeeded by Lord David Owen as Special Envoy, and the lead negotiator in the conflict. In 1993, he would co-author the Vance-Owen Plan and the Owen-Stoltenberg Plan, although ultimately they would be rejected. Bosnian Serbs believed that they could achieve more territory with military action. Many believed that this was just the groundwork for an easily partitioned state, which could be taken over by British influence. With the Soviet Union gone, the question of the political order of the East was highly pressing, particularly to Britain, who had had centuries of attempting to assert influence in the region. There was concern that this conflict could limit the global order's influence, and that it could threaten economic interests. There were British economic projects and businesses in the region, ones which they very much wanted to keep. On top of that, Iran had become a major arms dealer to the Bosnian government, and Britain was concerned as to how to balance their interests and goals in the region while maintaining their relationships and diplomatic influence in the Middle East. In February 1994, a mortar blast in Sarajevo would kill 68 civilians. NATO would issue an ultimatum to the Bosnian Serbs: withdraw heavy weaponry from Sarajevo or face airstrikes. The heavy hand of NATO appeared to make a significant impact. In March 1994, the Washington Agreement would be signed in Washington, D.C., ending the conflict between the Bosnian government and the Bosnian Croats. A new federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina would be created from the agreement. In July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces would overrun the United Nations safe areas and kill over 8,000 Bosniak Muslims. In response to this, and a second attack in Sarajevo, NATO would begin a sustained air campaign, running continual strikes against Bosnian Serb military targets. On December 14, 1995, a peace agreement would be signed in Paris. The state of Bosnia and Herzegovina would be formed, divided into two entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska. The conflict had ended, and post-Soviet Eastern Europe was beginning to form into its new, modern entities. Yet this wouldn't be the only Eastern European conflict of the era. In 1989, Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic had revoked the autonomy of Kosovo, sparking heavy resistance. The resistance would not begin violently, yet in the early 1990s, as the resistance seemed to get little result, the Kosovo Liberation Army would be formed, beginning attacks on police and government targets. In response, in February 1998, Serbian police would begin attacks on ethnic Albanian villages, killing 20. Resistance from the Kosovo Liberation Army would only grow, and in March 1998, Serbian forces would attack the compound of the KLA leader, Adem Jashare, killing him and dozens of his family members. This would galvanize Albanian support for the KLA and draw international ire. In the summer of that year, Serbia would launch major offenses to drive the KLA out from its strongholds. International media would begin covering the story, reporting a campaign of ethnic cleansing. In September, the United Nations Security Council would demand a ceasefire, withdrawal, and an end to hostilities. Great thing they stepped in. Everyone just looked around and said, well, I didn't know this would upset the UN. It did absolutely nothing, and the war continued. But the UN did achieve one great success. At their next cushy cocktail party, they successfully injured themselves, patting themselves on the back too hard. On January 15th, 1999, Serbian forces would kill 45 ethnic Albanians. It would be described as a massacre, and be a powerful moment in galvanizing international opposition and support for intervention. Through February and March of 1999, mediators would attempt to broker a peace, and in March, NATO would begin a 78-day bombing campaign in Yugoslavia, attempting to force Milosevic's forces to withdraw. This time, the United States was much more directly involved. Many came to believe that the response to the Bosnian War was too indecisive, and that the West should act more aggressively and directly. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright would become one of the driving figures in this endeavor, while General Wesley Clark, one of the main architects. Even more aggressive than the American administration was Prime Minister Tony Blair. He and Defense Minister George Robertson had been extremely hawkish for years. He believed that the United States was not going far enough in its bombing campaign, going so far as to suggest a full-scale ground invasion. This would prompt the more hesitant Americans to increase bombing efforts. Yet on June 9th of 1999, an agreement would be signed, with Yugoslavia withdrawing all of their military and police from Kosovo, and establishing international peacekeepers, putting the region under direct Anglo American control. The last of the Serbian forces would withdraw 2 days later, on June 11th, 1999. Anglo America had clearly asserted itself as hegemon in Eastern Europe. In 2000, the presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore would be highly contested, with results not known immediately, hinging on a disputed count in Florida, which had gone to a recount. Ultimately, George W. Bush would become president. George W. Bush was born in New Haven, Connecticut in 1946, growing up in Midland, Texas, the son of George H.W. and Barbara Bush. He became involved with politics via his father. He was involved in his father's 1988 campaign. He had launched his own campaign in 1978, an unsuccessful House bid, yet in 1994 was elected as governor of Texas. He focused on education reform, tax cuts, and criminal justice reform. He was part of a wing of Republicans who branded themselves as the compassionate conservatives, ones who were concerned with order and justice, yet with a concern for the lower classes and the poor. At this point, both the Democrats and Republicans were heavily trying to brand as compassionate champions of the lower classes, particularly as both parties had become extremely corporatist at this point, and were both jockeying to get the support of various large business interests. He would face a problem pretty immediately into his presidency. The massive enthusiasm that had built up for internet companies would break in 2000, with the Nasdaq experiencing a sizable crash. The wild hype and optimism that had fueled the explosive growth of dot-com stocks had come to an abrupt end. It would be called the dot-com bubble, and its crash would lead to a brief recession. Bush had put a lot of emphasis on missile and aerospace technology, on defense sector innovation, and the promise of space. Yet those goals would be swiftly derailed, and he would find his administration dominated by the neocons and imperial faction. In 2001, the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center would firmly entrench his administration in the hands of the Warhawk factions, shifting its policy to the global war on terror. In October 2001, the Patriot Act would be passed, creating perhaps the largest expansion of government, and particularly government surveillance power, that has ever been seen in American history. It was an enormous and successful power grab by the State Department, by the intelligence agencies, and by the neoconservative imperialist Warhawk faction. The entire mood of the country shifted. There was an extremely successful campaign of, you either support the government and all it's doing, or you want the terrorists to win. This has time and time again proved to be an extremely effective propaganda tactic. There is an enemy. The government is going to do blank about it. If you are opposed to blank, that means that you want the enemy to win. And every time, in retrospect, people look back and say, oh, that was really foolish to think like that, but will again and again find themselves falling into it. It's extremely effective. And right now, the enemy was Islamic terror. In March 2003, an Anglo American coalition would invade Iraq, in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Its stated goals were to liberate and bring freedom to the people of Iraq, and to remove the ability for Saddam Hussein to use weapons of mass destruction. For years now, American and British intelligence had been building up a story that Saddam Hussein was building a vast weapons program. This narrative was heavily supported by the US and UK media. The UK media, in particular, was extremely closely intertwined with British intelligence and the imperial ruling class. Not merely a supporter of the regime, but very often the direct owners of the UK's largest media firms were people in government, people with extremely close ties to British intelligence. The separation between the ruling class, intelligence, and the media was non-existent. In 2002, the National Intelligence Estimate would be published. The CIA would claim that Saddam Hussein had an ongoing WMD program, that he had biological and chemical weapons, and that he was engaging in an active nuclear program. The Defense Intelligence Agency would be frequently cited by pro-invasion figures like Secretary Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld. The Defense Intelligence Agency provided active assessments, continuing to make bold claims about the weapons program in Iraq. In September 2002, the British Joint Intelligence Committee would present the September Dossier to Parliament. It claimed that Saddam had chemical and biological weapons, that he had an active nuclear program, and that his weapons could be deployed within 45 minutes. This claim that they could be deployed within such a short time was frequently repeated across British media, a major talking point for those who wanted to depict the threat of Saddam Hussein as imminent, justifying the need to invade. Figures like George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Secretary Powell all made the argument that Saddam Hussein must be stopped, and that Iraq must be invaded. One of the only figures who was perhaps more hawkish again was Tony Blair. He gave incredibly passionate speeches, arguing not only that it was necessary or pragmatic to invade Iraq and to remove Saddam Hussein from power, but he spoke of it as though it were a religious moral obligation, and to him, to his world, his commitment to the British imperial project, it was religious. Secretary of State for Defense, Jeff Hoon, and head of the JIC, John Scarlett, would lend support to this idea. The ruling factions of the United States and Britain were entirely in line that the imperial order must assert itself in Iraq and must remove Saddam Hussein. They argued that Hussein was linked to terrorism, that a terrorist-aligned, brutal leader who was abusing his people could not be allowed to have such weapons, that it was the moral obligation of the West to remove the threat of Hussein and to liberate Iraq. They used very passionate liberal philosophical language, harkening back to tabula rasa notions, that the region would be just like the West. They would value our freedoms, our liberty, our values, if only they hadn't had the imposition of the Hussein government on them. They would be Western liberals if it weren't for their rulers. And thus, in this end-of-history world, where liberalism is of course the end state of humanity, the only moral thing for the United States and Britain to do was to remove the chains of their oppression, to remove the chains of their backwards Baathist beliefs, and to bring them in to the post-history liberal utopia, and that it must be done with the barrel of a gun. With figures like Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney, the Bush administration adopted a policy of regime change, and in the United Kingdom, the powerful neoconservative imperial faction and the cabinet of Tony Blair feared loss of imperial control. Saddam Hussein had moved very aggressively against the hegemony of the order. If Hussein could be allowed to do this, then that would surely result in more of the Middle East breaking away from under the control of the order. Anglo American hegemony must be enforced, for if they allowed Saddam Hussein to pose an alternative, then it would be the beginning of the end for the Imperium in such a vitally important economic and strategic region. As well, they thought to strengthen the US-UK special relationship, that this project could reinforce Anglo America, and in the post-Soviet end of history, send a clear message as to the strength of Anglo America's might. The empire would go to war. George Bush would be re-elected in 2004, and during the initial years of the war, his administration was quite popular, and in 2007, the surge would begin in Iraq, with an effort to begin a period of nation-building, reordering the nation in the order's vision and under its control. The British and American governments would say that they were building Iraq into a liberal democracy like them, but of course this never panned out. Instead, they took over economic control. The region was extremely important, strategically and economically with its oil interests, becoming rebuilt as an imperial outpost. Toward the end of 2007, a series of foreclosures would begin to pick up. The economy began showing signs of weakness, and in 2008, Barack Obama would be elected. Obama was born in Hawaii in August 1961. Or he was born in Kenya as Barry Soetoro. Maybe. I don't know.
Some people are saying, many people are saying.
He would grow up with his mother and stepfather in Indonesia, before moving to live with his grandparents in Hawaii, attending school there. He would go to Occidental College in Los Angeles, before transferring to Columbia in 1983 to study political science and international relations, because the best way to learn about having good relationships with people is by learning it in a lecture. He would do business in New York for a couple years, before moving to Chicago, becoming a community organizer in the South Side. He was firmly entrenched in the New Left, involved in the new social justice philosophies developed out of critical theory. He was very much a product of that academic environment of the time. He was highly politically active and a socialist, drawing much inspiration from Saul Alinsky, yet he tended to not ascribe a specific philosophical system to his beliefs. Instead, he was extremely pragmatic. He had goals, and would do whatever needed to be done to achieve them. Contrary to many of his peers, he was much more willing to try different things, much more willing to be pragmatic, and to do whatever needed to be done, as opposed to remaining locked into a particular ideological framework. He began to take his social political beliefs and increasingly view law and government as the avenue to achieve them. He joined the Illinois State Senate in 1996, representing the south side of Chicago. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2004, and in 2007 he would announce a presidential bid. His campaign was rooted around optimism and change. His primary slogans were "Yes, we can," and "Change we can believe in." It was an optimism campaign. People had become dissatisfied with the administration. People had soured on the Middle East campaigns and the global war on terror, which had become an endless quagmire. It was a rejection of the status quo. And even though Barack Obama would prove to be deeply entrenched in the ruling factions of Washington and Europe, he presented a very effective campaign. The economy, already showing signs of a brewing crisis, with many Americans now facing foreclosure. Obama ran on a platform that the economy was broken, that taxes should be lowered on the middle and lower classes, that the upper classes should pay more on taxes, and the economy more tightly regulated. He presented a scapegoat for the American people to blame, all while promising that the government could fix it, that the old regime had been corrupt and stuck in a bygone age that no longer worked for the America of today. He argued that America should withdraw from Iraq, and that the American military should be redirected to Afghanistan. He offered a program of affordable health care for all Americans, saying that the government could provide. He presented a good, clean image, and in a direct attack against the energy interests that had backed the Bush administration, argued for more energy regulation, and that the United States should move to green renewable energy. He was a foundational figure in the modern government-led green movement, arguing that the United States should move away from oil and gas. Much of the 21st century Democratic Party would be built around the image that he cultivated. The Democrat Party would come to rely on his coalition strategy, which would become increasingly dependent on ethnic resentment, building a coalition of the upper class, the managerial class, unmarried college-educated women, and ethnic minorities. And at this time, while Americans were tired of the Middle East war and becoming increasingly concerned about the economy, this youthful figure, with optimistic promises, was highly effective. Yet just about as the election was occurring, in September 2008, the collapse of the powerful investment bank Lehman Brothers would send shockwaves around the world. The economic crisis was far deeper than people had realized.